You're not afraid of the dark, are you?
All right, peace, fam. Welcome to the Dark Warrior channel. It's your host, Dark Warrior. So today we're gonna do a little something different. If those who can recall, back in May, I think May 29th of this year, I did a video called the History of the Afro magazine, in which I took you from the first initial magazine up until present day magazine. The first initial magazine was the Colored American magazine, published in 1900. And so, after a few interviews and other videos that I've published on the Dark Warrior Perspective channel, I decided to go back and refresh your memory, but break down more of the history of the Colored American magazine, and really go page by page in some of the issues that I have. So, with no further ado, what's going to happen today is just we're going to cut this down to about 3 or 4 parts. I'm not going to read word for word, line for line in the magazine, but I wanted to kind of really paint a picture on the frame of thought of the writers and the publishers and the editors of that magazine during that time. Remember, this is 1900. The edition was created in 1900 and it lasted for 9 years. It ended in 1909. So it was founded by Walter Wallace, Jesse W. Watkins, Harper S. Fortune, and Walter Alexander Johnson. And the leading editor was a woman by the name of Pauline Hopkins. She was originally out of Portland, Maine, but she grew up in Boston, Massachusetts. And the magazine, it covered business, arts, education, medicine, politics, etc. All the issues that was going on within the African American community at the time. And it was published by the Colored Cooperative Publishing Company. And so Pauline Hopkins, who was a brilliant journalist, historian, and editor, she did a lot of novels, but her main objective was to point out a lot of the racism and a lot of issues we were having in our community. And she was highly influenced by W.E.B. Du Bois. She herself faced a lot of sexism and racism. And so later on, as the magazine was really doing well and it was progressing in its issues, Booker T. Washington had brought someone by the name of John C. Fruit. He and Booker T. Washington were friends, and Booker T. Washington was as brilliant as he was. He also had his way of thinking for what the African Americans should be doing and should they be and how they should be thinking. And so he and John C. Fruit, who was an outside investor, was also an editor, and so he became the editor of the magazine around 1903. Because what happened was Booker T. Washington felt as though what Pauline Hopkins was doing was causing more strife in race relations. You see, because she was pointing out a lot of the wrongdoings towards the African American, and so so Mr. Fruit, being discovered by Booker T. Washington, became the editor later on. And they, like I said, they really was against her being extremely outspoken about racial matters, and which it was taboo back then. And so, and how do we know this? It was later revealed in her letters that were discovered in 1996 by Fisk University. So, and she had like 20 letters or so that really revealed what she was going through, battling towards Booker T. Washington and Mr. Fruit. And they just had different ideas in different directions they wanted the magazine to go. And just to really put it more in perspective, Mr. Fruit, his thought process was to record the work first of the colored people, make whites comfortable and aware. And unfortunately, too, as he tried to make whites more comfortable, it almost took away from the plight that African Americans was going through. And so he also began like patronizing those who were successful, who unfortunately the same ones who were financially supporting the Colored American magazine. So as you can see, within those 9 years, there was a turn of events where it was progressively doing well to reveal problems, and then eventually you could see it begin a landslide when the vision of the magazine turned. So that is the intro or the brief history on the Colored American magazine. And so with no further ado, we're going to start with part one of the Colored American magazine. All right, welcome back. So as I promised, we're going to start with part one. What I want you guys to do, if you look at the cover page, you'll see it's really vibrant with red coloring. And it begins with "The Negroes, Part and New National Problems" by Frank Putnam. He was an editor of the Chicago Times Herald, and so we'll cover that later on in some of his perceptions of what they declared the Negro problem in the nation. It's published in June 1900. As you can see, it was 15 cents a number, or $1.50 a year. An illustrated monthly, devoted to literature, science, music, art, religion, facts, fiction, and tradition. This particular edition of the magazine, they had posted a graduate from Yale, James Warren Patton, and his story is covered on page 80. And as you can see, like I told you in the intro, it's published by the Color Cooperative Publishing Company, right there in Boston, Massachusetts, right off of 232 West Canton Street. So they put a lot of time into really, making this appealing for the people at the time, particularly illustrating a graduate of Yale in 1900. So if you scroll down, copywritten in 1900, this is official. And when you go into the table of contents, you'll see that the Colored American magazine talks about in the same format or the initial format as you see the Jet magazine and Ebony and the Crisis and all those magazines that we'll talk about later on. You'll see how it has page 69, the Negro Part in the National Problems. You'll have a poem written by Olivia Ward Bush. Grand Opera as we see it by H.S. Fortune. James Ward Patton. See, remember, these are all the names of the people who had helped founded this. So they orchestrated the direction. You look down here and you'll see Pauline E. Hopkins talk about in the women's department. And so they made sure that everything that you needed to know nationwide is here. Because remember, there's not too many magazines out at the time. In fact, this was the only one. So we're going to scroll down and we're going to kind of speed this up and not bore you to death about all. We're not going to go word for word, but just to kind of give you the basis of it. So you can see a free yearly subscription to any person who will take a few moments of their spare time and interest, their friends, to subscribe for the Colored American magazine. Your friends will your friends will all want it. You would only take the time to show it to them. Collect $1.50 from each and forward the 2 subscriptions with remittance to our office, and we will enter your name for a year subscription free. So you can see they're promoting the magazine and they're giving you deals, because we scoff at the fact that this is $1.50 a year, but then put it in perspective how much each Black American family or African American family, whatever title you want want to declare yourself to be, look how much each family was making then. Let's put that in perspective, okay? And so as you go through this advertisement of wanting you to subscribe to the channel, they once again reiterate the Color Cooperative Publishing Company right there in Boston, Massachusetts. All right, so we're going to scroll down. I also want you to look at some of the wear and tear of the magazine. This is just to show you how this magazine is really have exchanged hands of people really studying it and taking time out to make sure that you and I have the pleasure of reading it. So we'll scroll down and we'll look through all the content and we'll get to the meat and potato of it, okay? So right here you can see the celebrated Sharp sisters. You can see how they illustrated Mr. Theodore Drury playing as Don Jose Carmen, which they talked about being on page 79. And then we get right into the meat of it. The Colored American Magazine, Volume 1, June 1900, number 2. The Negro's Part in New National Problems. A personal view by whom? Frank Putnam of Chicago. Okay? Note, the editor of the Colored American Magazine has asked me to write my views on present political aspects of the race problem. And with the limited light that I possess, I have tried to comply with his request. It is not to be expected that all men will agree upon problems of such great magnitude, nor is it likely that the editor is in agreement with all that I have set forth. If the reader will follow my letter through the end, he will be able to judge for himself the mistakes in the premises, the flaws in the resultant arguments. Of him, I ask merely that he accept my earnest assurance that this is no paid argument. Democracy gives no retaining fees. Her purse holds hardly even the prospect of an ability to pay in worldly measure for the services of their advocates. Indeed, democracy is not a party, but a principle, an idea. It is the principle of protest continually forcing the concessions from the entrenched in office aristocracy of money. See, so as you can see, that's the note from the editor, okay? But then what I want you to just pick out carefully, look at what he begins his writing with. He says, no other American citizen is so vitally interested in the right settlement of the problems growing out of the Spanish-American War as the colored man. He is today 35 years out of bondage. Not quite 20 years ago, he was declared free as an incident of a war to preserve the Union. Now think about that. He says he was declared free as an incident of a war to preserve the Union. Remember, Lincoln only freed the slaves to preserve the Union. He had to save the country. Okay? Doubtless, most of you who read this will say that his emancipation was the primary purpose of that war. In a broad general sense, it was. But men do not always see the end when they begin. Finite minds do not read the purposes of infinite wisdom until after the fact. Slavery made the war necessary because it debauched the moral character of the Southern people, destroyed their ideas of abstract justice and liberty, and led them to jeopard the life of the Republic of attempting to divide it. So that's just what the editor, Mr. Putnam, had wrote within the Colored Magazine, the Colored American Magazine in 1900. Okay, and so take that in account. Of course, we're not going to read throughout his whole editorial in this particular edition, but I wanted to kind of highlight that to give you an idea of where they were going with it. Okay, so stay tuned for part 2. We're going to start into another part of the magazine and show you just the diversity and where the magazine was going, to give us information about our situation at the time. All right, guys. So we're going to go ahead and go into part two of this brief presentation. As you can see, part one was just giving you a glimpse of the social ideology of the African American at the time, or what they called the Negro or colored person. So part two, we're going to delve into the artistry of how they highlighted those who are in opera of some sort. And one in particular was by the man by the name of Theodore Drury, and they said that he was a gentleman of many attainments and a vocalist. And so, if you look here where it says Grand Opera as we see it, it was written by H.S. Fortune, the musical editor. Remember, he's one of the co-founders of the magazine. And he starts off saying that the performance of Carmen, which was the opera in which Theodore Drury starred at the Lexington Avenue Opera House up there in New York, by the Drury Grand Opera Company, will be long remembered by the opera-loving public of the greater New York. Grand opera by colored singers, both principal and chorus, is progress worth mentioning. This is the first affair of the kind executed successively. It was characterized by a high degree of suavity with a total lack of friction or amateurism. And he says that Theodore Drury is a gentleman of many attainments and a vocalist of rare ability. Mr. Drury seeks to relieve that feeling of inferiority to the whites under which people labor in music and art, and he is well fitted by his abilities and education to be leader in his new departure. So you can see he highlighted Mr. Drury in such great admiration, because once again there has been this cloud put upon us that for every right thing that we do, you know, it is like you uplifting your own, like everyone that looks like you, your community, the whole quote unquote Negro race. But then the flip side of that coin is one incident or that may be done by one particular person of the African race is now deemed as the dread. You know, the whole African race is such. So it was really like a damn if you do and damn if you don't, you know, type of situation. So in this particular example, Theodore Drury was in fact highlighted with high admiration in the arts of opera. And if you look more into the article in which he wrote, he goes on to say that Mr. Theodore Drury is more than a singer. He is a thorough musician, and like most artists, is adept at many accomplishments. He is almost as good as a piano as he is a singer. His technique is excellent, and he is a devotee to interpretation of the composer's music with sympathetic exactness, rather than mere brilliancy or striving for startling effects. I mean, so you don't get no better than that he spoke very highly about this man and really appreciated his ability to do wonders with his vocals and being a pianist. So this is just one of the articles written to highlight the artistry of that time. And then what we'll do next is go into the education part, you know, of the graduate of Yale, Mr. Payton. So stay tuned for part 3. Okay, so far we've covered the social, some brief history or perspectives of the social injustice or how they were trying to tackle social issues of the African American at the time. We highlighted Theodore Drury when it comes to his magnificent performance in the opera musical entitled Carmen. So we're going to look into Mr. James Warren Payton, who was on the front cover of the magazine. He's the graduate of Yale back in 1900. And we're going to just read over some of the inserts of Mr. Peyton. And it goes like this. So, as the days of my college life draw to a close and my work at Yale is nearly finished, it is with much gratification that I give a few personal experiences and describe it in a brief manner. Some Yale customs may prove of interest to the reader. I now feel somewhat like a condemned man must feel when he knows his days are numbered, since in a few weeks I will leave college halls forever and join the ranks of those who are fighting the battle of life. During the period of 4 years spent at Yale, a fellow leads a very varied life, teeming with pleasures and joys, rarely ever clouded by sorrow or care. Just as soon as I had passed the 20 examinations required for entrance and had obtained my certificate of admission to the freshman class, I find myself hustling off with a crowd of classmates down to the green to hear the Honorable W.H. Bryan defend the silver issue. Well, you doubtlessly remember what occurred. How the upperclassmen raised such havoc that even the persuasiveness of the orator's silver tongue could not stay their vociferous shouting of "We want McKinley." So as you read this, you can almost feel that despite his honor and his achievement of graduating from Yale, the nervousness, the fear of what now, that he's leaving a challenging program, as we can only assure for those who attended Yale. I know I haven't, but you can see how just going through college and going through that strenuous curriculum to now wondering what's next for me, you see. And so, and remind you, 1900, graduate of Yale, what's next for the African American at that time, even with high honors, is a question mark. And from my understanding, he did very well. So, if you when you read this, and if you was to ever get your hands on a copy of this, read the words closely. You can almost feel like they were excited, but there was some fear. And rightfully so, because there's been many occasions of being highly educated and yet being marginalized because the hue of your skin. So Mr. Peyton should definitely be commended for his achievement, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to really delve a little bit more into these magazines, these editions of this magazine in particular, and show you what was going on regarding his progress and achievements back then. So I hope you enjoyed this part. We're going to start getting more into other aspects of the magazine here shortly. Okay, so another abstract in the magazine that I would like to highlight is entitled The 8th Illinois, USV, by Charles Winslow Hall. And he goes on to write this: the African people, who have been noted for military efficiency in the long and bloody annals of the world's wars, the courage, endurance, and fiery valor of the black and tawny warriors of the Egypt, Ethiopian, Numidia, and Carthage, fill the histories of the remotest past, and are reflected in the English defeats and dearly won victories of South Africa and the Sudan, the terrible destruction of Italian and Egyptian invaders in Abyssinia, and the recitals of scores of European explorers and prisoners who have witnessed the desperate and unsparing warfare of the Dark Continent. In North America, our colonial legends are full of incidental recognition of the services of both slaves and free men of color, who fought the Indian enemy, helped to repel French aggressions, and conquer New France, fought under the British flag against the Spaniards, fell among the earliest a martyr of our own rebellion against British tyranny, and followed the fortunes and misfortunes of the Continental Army, through good and ill, until the final triumph of the Republic. There has never been a war of of consequence in which old glory has been waved over massed battalions or reeling war decks in which the Afro-American has not proved himself a brave man, quick to obey, willing to fight, and, if need be, ready to die for a land whose pledge of liberty and equality of manhood has, as to him, been a lie. In the Spanish-American War of 1898-1999, the Negro citizen received little recognition. One company, Colonel L. 6th Regiment of Massachusetts Infantry, USV, officered by colored gentlemen, took part in the occupation of Puerto Rico. Ohio had colored companies in the field, and regiments of immunes and regular troops, commanded by white officers, performed services none less the meritorious that they were sedulously minimized by the American press. Illinois alone of all the states sent into the field a full regiment of infantry whose every man and officer from colonel to bugler was an Afro-American. So as you can see, the illustration presented by the author of this particular abstract clearly noted that we've been fighting in so many wars and been victorious in so many conflicts from ancient Kemet all the way up to present day at that moment, and yet and still, with all the devotion and all the time spent, liberty has always never been served to us fully. So these were some of the issues, once again, that was really pointed out to in the early 1900s for the Afro-American. Another subject matter that I found very interesting to read was the subject of healthcare, and one abstract, particularly in this edition of the magazine, talks about the importance of good teeth. And as you can see, is written by Dr. T.W. Robinson, surgeon, dentist. And he goes on to say that to maintain the general health to the highest possible degree, good teeth are essential. To neglect these very important organs will only be conducive to various bodily ailments which carry with them untold suffering. It is peculiar circumstance, and one which I could never understand, that many people, though of the most timid nature and nervous temperament, would readily submit to being placed under the influence of anesthetic, and allowing the most difficult surgical operations to be performed upon them. And when sensitive little tooth requires attention, they shrink from it with almost mortal fear, dreading the ordeal of going to the dentist and having it operated today. That when I initially read that, I chuckled, as you heard me chuckle now, because it still goes on in 2018, in which unfortunately many people in our population do not take good care of their teeth. However, with not being responsible enough to take care of their teeth, they'll go through this horrible procedure of dental care. So I found it I found a little humor in this abstract, but I definitely enjoyed it, because in 1900 even the care of your teeth was still being emphasized and highly recommended. He also goes on to say that the teeth are the sole organs of manifestation, holding an important relation to the digestive functions. We all know that with bad teeth and gum disease can cause further health issues and ultimately death. And so they really emphasized it in this. And he says, and through it to the entire organs, they have also inseparable connections with the nervous, circulatory, and respiratory systems, and should therefore be kept in a healthy condition, so as to properly perform the functions for which nature designed them. So, the Colored American magazine is covering all the issues in which we're still talking about today, socially, politically, the reminder of our sacrifice to build a nation, to save many nations, in which we're still not being fully given the rights to, and also health issues, particularly with the dentist was speaking about, the doctor who was talking about the care of your teeth and the troublesome in which, if you do not, he states that the inability to properly masticate the food is conducive to dyspepsia and various stomach troubles, nervousness, headache, dizziness, a general wasting away of strength and flesh. In other words, you are killing yourself. So I wanted to just highlight that in this magazine, and I found that very interesting to show you. So we'll continue to go on to more abstracts in the magazine. All right, so it wouldn't be fair if I did not end this on a good note. We're going to get into just the closing and how they finished up each one of their magazines, and they ended with the chief editor at the time. It was edited by Pauline E. Hopkins in the women's department, and she notes that we bring to this column an enthusiastic desire to do good and pleasing work for our lady patrons, and to that end we'll be pleased to receive suggestions from all of our friends. We'll be glad to correspond with all women's clubs in relation to club matters, to insert club notices, and etc. And she asks that you send in the name of your club and its officers for enrollment for records. And then, of course, you can see right here, club records, the National Association of Colored Women's Club, Mrs. Mary Church Terrell, president. You have Mrs. Booker T. Washington, who is the chairman of executive committees. The particulars containing all matters of national interest to women found full in National Associate Notes, and that was published by Mrs. Washington in Tuskegee, Alabama. So they were covering all of their bases of making sure, if you scroll down, you'll see they was making sure that everyone, whether you were in Boston or New York, all of the clubs that was dealing with women relations was covered too. So both the men and women, and that's the equality that was deserving. And of course, if your chief executive is one of the greatest editors ever, Miss Pauline Hopkins, then of course you already know that's what's going to take place. And so what they did too, what I really appreciated, as I had began reading the magazine, and so far I've read 4 editions of this particular magazine. They would cover people like Miss Eva E. Rusa, who graduates from the New England Conservatory of Music. And she, her family is musical. Her brother's playing on many difficult instruments: the xylophone, the sleigh bells, the Italian harp, cello, etc. She had a beautiful voice, from my understanding. She sang in the range of soprano, so they highlighted her. And then what they would do was they would put their announcements out, a yearly subscription free to all readers who secure 2 years paid by subscriptions, or an amount of 3 or 6 month subscriptions to the equivalent of 2 yearly. They went on to say that we introduced this month our new feature, the Women's Column, under the charge of Miss Pauline E. Hopkins, and we would extend an invitation to our women readers to contribute anything of note which would be the slightest benefit to our women. So the women's movement, or the progress for the African American woman, was definitely a plus. And if anyone who's following me on Instagram, or Facebook, or any social media that I'm a part of, primarily in Instagram, you will see that I highlight a lot of African American women achievements. So what they to wrap this up, if you go to the end of the magazine, you will see them advertise all of your local businesses, whether it was dealing with the meals, people, Crystal Palace dining room, where they're serving food, ice cream parlor, they give you the dates and times. You're talking about typewriter repair, anything regarding to help out the community, bakers and caterers. All of the advertisements of businesses that was needed for the community was right there for you. In fact, I found it funny that a writing machine, what they called it, aka a typewriter, was priced at $75 right there in Newark, New Jersey. So the magazine, it's one of the greatest things that I've come across. I have all of them. This is going to be a routine that I do for you guys on a weekly basis. Just to wrap this up, I'm going to really get more in detail about the history of these magazines, whether it's the colored magazines, the Crisis, the Jet, the Negro World, whatever. You're going to be seeing more and more of this information coming out, so you can appreciate the effort and the diligence that was put forth to make sure that we became a progressive citizen in the United States. So I really hope that you appreciate this. I hope you really enjoyed it as much as I did. This is my first edition, and I look forward to you joining me on my second one coming up soon. So no further ado. Thanks for tuning in to the Dark Warrior Perspective. Please follow me on Dark Warrior Perspective on Instagram. And also, if you got any questions, you got any suggestions, leave them down here in the comment section, or you can even email me at darkwarriorperspective@gmail.com. Hit your boy up. Any topic or anything you want me to cover, I'm here for you. All right, so I appreciate that. So peace to everyone, and enjoy your day. Peace.